I always thought I had life figured out. I'm Miles, a guy who built himself up from scratch. 20 years ago, I started a car rental business with 3 used sedans and a dream. Through grit and sleepless nights, that dream turned into a luxury fleet serving high-end clients across Florida. The success let me give Sophie, my wife, everything she could ever ask for. Mansions, private schools for our daughter, and vacations that most people only see in magazines. But looking back, I realize none of that ever mattered to her. Sophie had a way of making you feel 2 inches tall without saying anything outright. She could turn a compliment into a subtle insult faster than I could finish my morning coffee. And the kicker? She'd make you feel guilty for noticing. "Oh, Miles, you're so sensitive," she'd say, rolling her eyes with that practiced smirk. For years, I ignored the little cracks in her mask, telling myself it was just her way of keeping things interesting. After all, she was stunning, smart, and had this magnetic energy that drew people in. Maybe I let her have too much power because I was so focused on growing the business, on making sure she and our daughter never had to worry about a thing. I thought I was being a good husband. Turns out, I was just the guy funding her secret life. It all unraveled on a quiet evening when I came back early from visiting my mom. I wasn't trying to sneak up on anyone, but as soon as I stepped through the door, I heard laughter. Not the light-hearted kind. This was the cruel, mocking sort that makes your skin crawl. Sophie's voice carried through the living room, sharp and cutting, as she laughed with her friends about the very life I had built for her. The words stopped me cold. Miles? He's predictable. A robot with a car obsession. And Calder? He's everything Miles isn't: raw, exciting, and real. I don't feel bad about it. Honestly, I'm doing him a favor. Maybe he'll stop pretending to be a big shot and learn to live a little. I leaned against the wall, trying to process what I was hearing. Calder, the janitor at her fitness club. The man cleaning up the sweat from her treadmill was apparently the one who'd stolen my wife's heart, or maybe just her attention. Sophie didn't even try to hide it. She bragged about it, as if stepping out on me was some act of self-discovery. Her voice turned colder, cutting even deeper. The best part? I'll take him for everything in the divorce. He can keep his precious cars. Calder and I will be driving Ferraris by the time I'm done with him. And just like that, everything I thought I knew about my life came crashing down. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in my office, surrounded by the trophies of my success. Photos of our family trips, awards for business excellence, and the first key from the used sedan that started it all. Each one now felt like a cruel joke. I wasn't the husband providing a dream life for his wife. I was the fool funding her betrayal. By the time dawn broke, I had a plan. Sophie wanted to play games? Fine. I'd play along. But not in the way she'd expect. That morning, I walked into the kitchen like nothing had changed. Sophie sat there, scrolling through her phone, a cup of coffee in one hand. She looked up briefly, flashed me her usual disinterested smile, and went back to whatever meaningless gossip was on her screen. If she felt any guilt, she didn't show it. Maybe she was too confident that I'd never find out, or too arrogant to care. I poured myself a cup of coffee, pretending to scroll through emails. "Morning," I said casually. "Morning," she replied, not even looking up. The normalcy of it all was maddening. She didn't realize I'd heard every word she said the night before. Every laugh. Every insult. Every plan to bleed me dry. I sat across from her, trying to act as if I wasn't boiling inside. My daughter, Emma, joined us at the table, her cheerful chatter a stark contrast to the tension I felt. Sophie's face softened when Emma walked in, like she was switching masks. She was good at that, pretending to be the perfect mom and wife when it suited her. After breakfast, Sophie kissed Emma on the cheek and grabbed her purse. "I'm heading to the club," she said, her tone breezy. "Have fun," I replied, forcing a smile. Once she left, I stared at the door, my mind racing. The old Miles would have confronted her right away, demanded an explanation. But I'd learned the hard way that reacting in the heat of the moment rarely ends well. No, I needed to be smarter than that. I needed to think 3 steps ahead, just like I did when I built my business. Step 1 was gathering evidence. If Sophie thought she could destroy me and walk away unscathed, she had no idea who she was dealing with. As Sophie walked out the door, I stood at the window, watching her stroll to her car with a casualness that twisted the knife further. She had no idea I knew, no inkling that her charade was crumbling. For a moment, I almost envied her audacity. Almost. But the anger brewing in me quickly swallowed any admiration. After Emma finished her breakfast and ran off to FaceTime her friend, I headed to the den. This space wasn't just my retreat, it was my sanctuary. A framed photo of Sophie and me from our honeymoon sat on the shelf. It caught my eye as I passed by, the memory of that trip souring instantly. Back then, I thought I'd married someone who believed in the same things I did. Loyalty, love, and building a life together. Now it seemed I'd misjudged her entirely. I flipped open my laptop and got to work. The first step was simple. Hire a private investigator. I knew my way around contracts and negotiations, so I picked up the phone and called a discreet service I'd once heard a client rave about. I kept my tone even, professional, as I explained what I needed. Within an hour, the investigator emailed me a questionnaire to provide details about Sophie's routines, Calder's workplace, and any suspicions I had. It felt surreal typing it all out. The fitness club, Calder, her late-night girls' dinners that never added up. Each sentence I wrote was another confirmation of how blind I'd been. Next came the financial groundwork. Sophie thought she was set to drain me dry, but what she didn't know was that I'd already started insulating my business years ago. I never trusted anyone entirely with the empire I'd built, not even her. Call it paranoia, but I'd set up contingencies in case of emergencies. What she called our wealth was mostly tied to the company, and she'd have to jump through legal hoops to get to it. By lunchtime, I'd begun another layer of preparation. Quietly liquidating assets I didn't care to keep. The spare property in Naples, the yacht I hardly used, they were already on their way to being sold. If she wanted to fight for material spoils, she'd find them gone. That afternoon, I paid a visit to my lawyer, Victoria. She had helped me structure my company when it first expanded, and if there was anyone I trusted, it was her. I walked into her office, and after some pleasantries, I laid it all out. The affair, Sophie's plans, my need to safeguard everything I'd built. Victoria was sharp as a knife and wasted no time strategizing. Florida's infidelity laws can work in your favor, she said, leaning back in her chair. If we prove adultery, she won't be entitled to spousal support. Depending on how we play this, we can protect your assets. But you'll need concrete proof. Photos, messages, anything. I nodded. I've already hired someone to gather evidence. She gave me a curt smile. Good. Now, we'll need to make sure your estate plan and business contracts are airtight. Let's review everything you own, including anything with Sophie's name on it. As we combed through the details, I felt a strange mix of anger and determination. If Sophie wanted a war, I was ready to fight, but this wasn't just about the money. It was about the principle, about showing her that actions have consequences. By the time I returned home, Emma was in the living room, watching cartoons with her headphones on. Sophie wasn't back yet, and I used the time to plant a small device under the lamp on her bedside table. It was a voice recorder, one of those high-tech gadgets that could pick up whispers. If Sophie had no qualms airing her betrayal to her friends, I had no doubt she'd be careless enough to let something slip at home. Later that evening, Sophie breezed through the door, carrying a gym bag and flashing me a practiced smile. I mirrored it, though the effort almost made me sick. Good workout? I asked, setting down the newspaper I wasn't reading. Yeah, exhausting. She sighed theatrically, dropping her bag by the stairs. They're adding new classes next month. You should check them out sometime. I raised an eyebrow, feigning mild interest. Maybe. If I can fit it into my schedule. She laughed lightly, already walking away. Well, don't work too hard. I'm going to shower. As she disappeared upstairs, I let my smile fade. My focus now wasn't on salvaging this marriage. It was on dismantling the illusion Sophie had built, and taking back control of my life. Over the next few days, I played the part of the oblivious husband. Sophie's routine didn't change. Morning workouts, lunches with friends, and the occasional late-night outing she claimed was for networking. She was so comfortable in her lies that she didn't notice the subtle shifts in my demeanor. I kept my voice steady, my expressions neutral, even when I wanted to call her out on every deception. Patience was my ally now. Every moment I stayed silent was another piece added to my plan. The investigator, Dan, kept me updated via email. Calder, it turned out, wasn't just a janitor. He moonlit as a personal trainer for certain preferred clients at the fitness club. Sophie was one of them. Dan's report included photos of them chatting too closely in the club's parking lot, grabbing coffee together afterward, and even walking hand in hand into a mid-range hotel off the highway. The photos hit me like a punch to the gut, but I forced myself to look at each one. Pain was part of the process. It reminded me why I was doing this. Dan also dug into Calder's background. The guy was in his late 20s, good-looking in a rough, unpolished way. He had a string of failed jobs and a debt history that would make a bank cringe. Sophie wasn't just risking her marriage. She was betting on someone who couldn't even keep his utilities paid on time. That knowledge fueled me, but it also raised questions. Why Calder? Was Sophie chasing some fantasy of excitement, or was this her way of punishing me for something I hadn't even realized I'd done? One evening, as I was reviewing financial statements in my office, Sophie peeked her head in. "You're always working," she said with a playful pout, leaning on the doorframe. I looked up, careful to keep my expression neutral. "Someone has to," I replied lightly, tapping the stack of papers in front of me. She laughed, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Don't burn yourself out. We should plan a getaway soon, just the two of us. Remember Cabo last year?" I forced a smile. "Hard to forget." She nodded, lingering for a moment longer, then left. As I heard her footsteps retreating, I stared at the doorway, feeling the weight of her audacity. She had the nerve to reminisce about a trip where I'd thought we were happy, while she was likely plotting her escape even then. Later that night, I retrieved the recorder from her bedside table. Listening to hours of mundane chatter was tedious, but it paid off. In one clip, Sophie was on the phone, her tone low and conspiratorial. "I know," she said, her voice dripping with mock sympathy. "Miles just doesn't get it. He's so predictable. He doesn't even notice when I'm out late." There was a pause, likely Calder's response on the other end, and then Sophie laughed softly. "Yeah, I know you don't mind. You're so different from him. You actually see me." I clenched my fists as her words replayed in my mind. "You actually see me. What a load of garbage." I'd seen her more clearly than anyone else ever could. I'd seen her ambition, her charm, her flaws, and I'd loved her despite all of it. But now I realized I'd been blind to the parts of her that mattered most. By the following morning, I had enough evidence to take the next steps. The recordings, the photos, the financial documents. They were all neatly organized in a digital folder labeled contingencies. But I wasn't just preparing to protect myself in court. I was preparing for the moment Sophie realized her carefully built house of cards was about to collapse. She thought I was predictable, that I'd grovel or break down in tears when the truth came out. She had no idea who she was dealing with. The Saturday following my discoveries, Sophie suggested we host a small dinner party. "Just a few friends," she said, waving her hand like it was nothing. "We haven't entertained in ages." Normally, I dread the idea. Sophie's dinner parties were more about her showing off than us spending time with friends. But this time, I saw an opportunity. "Sounds like a good idea," I said casually. "Who are you thinking of inviting?" Her eyes lit up. "Oh, the usual crowd. Megan, Oliver, maybe Rachel and Keith. And I'll invite Jenna from the club. She's been dying to see the house." Jenna. I recognized her name from the voice recordings. Sophie had been sharing details of our marriage with her, treating our private life like gossip fodder. Perfect. Over the next few days, I played the part of the dutiful husband, helping Sophie prep for the party. I ordered wine, arranged catering, and even spent an afternoon cleaning the backyard patio. She seemed pleased, if a little surprised, by my enthusiasm. On the night of the party, Sophie was in her element, flitting between guests with a glass of champagne in hand, laughing at jokes that weren't funny and tossing compliments like confetti. I stayed in the background, observing. As the evening went on, I made a point to engage Jenna in conversation. She was younger than Sophie by a few years, with the same polished, confident air. When I asked how they knew each other, she beamed. "Oh, we met at the club. Sophie's the best. Always the life of the party, you know." "Sounds like her," I said, forcing a smile. Jenna leaned in, lowering her voice. "She's lucky to have you though. A lot of husbands don't. Well, they don't measure up, if you know what I mean. I raised an eyebrow, playing dumb. How do you mean? Jenna hesitated, as if realizing she'd said too much. Oh, nothing. Just, Sophie's told me how supportive you are. Not every husband is like that. I nodded, letting her words hang in the air. Jenna might not have said anything incriminating, but she confirmed what I already knew. Sophie had been venting to her about me. Later, as the party wound down, I made my next move. Pulling Sophie aside in the kitchen, I put on my best sheepish grin. I was thinking, I said, keeping my tone light, maybe we should take that trip you mentioned. Just the two of us. Her eyes widened in surprise. Really? You're serious? Why not? Things have been busy lately. We could use a break. Sophie hesitated for a moment, then smiled. I think that's a great idea. Good. It was exactly what I needed her to think. The following day, while Sophie was at her usual yoga class, I made arrangements. I booked a weekend trip to the Keys, close enough to be convenient, far enough to serve my purpose. I also reached out to Dan, the investigator, asking him to keep tabs on Sophie while we were away. This trip wasn't about reconciliation. It was about setting the stage. Sophie wanted me to believe we could repair what she destroyed, but I wasn't interested in playing the victim. I was interested in watching her realize that the game was over. When she got home later that afternoon, I greeted her with a printed itinerary. All set, I said, handing it to her. She scanned the paper, her smile widening. This looks amazing, Miles. Thank you. Anything for you, I replied, my voice steady. Sophie kissed me on the cheek, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath my calm exterior. Let her think I was the doting husband for now. The trip to the Keys would be the perfect backdrop for the truth to come out, and for Sophie to see just how far ahead I was playing. The trip to the Keys started like a scene out of one of those travel brochures Sophie used to leave on the counter as hints. The ocean shimmered under the morning sun, and Sophie seemed in her element, leaning back in her seat and humming along to the playlist I'd thrown together. Her carefree attitude might have softened me once, but now it felt like a mask, one I was determined to peel away. The boutique resort was everything she loved. White stucco walls, lush gardens, and a private villa with its own plunge pool. Sophie glided through the villa as if she owned the place, marveling at every detail with the excitement of someone who thought they were being indulged. It was an act I'd seen 100 times before, though it stung differently now. The first evening was deceptively peaceful. At dinner by the beach, Sophie radiated charm, chatting about Emma's school projects and the usual gossip about friends. She talked about plans for the house, for vacations, for a life she seemed so sure was hers to control. I listened, nodding in all the right places, letting her believe this was the getaway she'd asked for. As we strolled along the shore after dinner, she slipped her hand into mine. The gesture used to feel like home. Now, it felt hollow. She murmured something about how this was exactly what we needed, her voice soft and full of unearned confidence. I agreed with her, though for entirely different reasons. The next morning, as Sophie lounged by the pool in her robe, I brought over coffee and croissants. She looked up at me with that practiced smile, the one that always seemed designed to disarm. But I wasn't here to be disarmed. Sitting across from her, I felt the weight of everything I'd been carrying since that night I overheard her. My plan wasn't about blowing up in anger, it was about precision, letting her know the foundations of her carefully constructed life were already cracking. I started talking about how I'd been reflecting on our relationship, keeping my tone even. I mentioned how this trip wasn't just about relaxing but about figuring things out, about honesty. Her smile faltered, just slightly, as if she sensed the undercurrent beneath my words. The atmosphere shifted as I kept talking. I didn't accuse her outright but instead laid out hints, how things didn't add up, how I'd noticed changes in her behavior. Sophie stiffened slightly, her movements more deliberate as she reached for her coffee. She tried to brush it off, saying something vague about how all marriages go through phases. Her avoidance only confirmed what I already knew. I pressed just enough to let her know I wasn't blind, that I had been watching closely. Her face shifted between irritation and uncertainty, her responses measured but betraying the cracks in her armor. I didn't go into detail about what I'd uncovered. Not yet. I didn't need to. The subtle pressure of my words was enough to unsettle her, to plant the seed of doubt that her plans were unraveling. Sophie wasn't one to admit guilt, but she couldn't completely hide the tension in her posture, the slight tremor in her voice when she asked if I was feeling okay. The rest of the day passed with an uneasy quiet between us. Sophie was more subdued than usual, her usual chatter replaced by thoughtful silences. I let her stew in it, watching as the realization began to take hold. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I sat on the villa's patio, sipping a drink and staring out at the ocean. Sophie joined me after a while, her movements slower, her smile dimmed. She didn't say much, just sat there with her glass of wine, occasionally glancing my way. I could see the questions swirling in her mind, the calculations she was running. Sophie had always been a strategist, but now she was realizing she might not be the one in control. That was exactly where I wanted her. The game was shifting, and it was only a matter of time before the final pieces fell into place. The day after our quiet evening on the patio, Sophie's demeanor had changed. She wasn't as chatty as usual, and there was a nervous edge to her movements. Her attempts to keep up the illusion of normalcy were almost admirable, but I saw through them. Each strained smile, every overly casual remark, it was all part of her effort to regain control of a situation she couldn't fully understand. We spent the morning wandering the resort's gardens. Sophie admired the lush greenery and exotic flowers, her compliments sounding forced, as though she were trying to fill the silence. I responded politely, keeping my tone neutral, giving her nothing to latch onto. Lunch was another exercise in polite tension. Sophie asked about work, about Emma's upcoming recital, about anything that would keep the conversation light. I answered her questions but didn't elaborate, letting her carry the weight of the dialogue. The strain was beginning to show in the way she fiddled with her napkin, her foot tapping softly against the tiled floor. In the afternoon, I left her at the spa and took a walk along the beach. It gave me time to think, to refine my next move. Sophie's unease told me she was beginning to understand that the game wasn't entirely in her hands. What she didn't know was how many steps ahead I already was. When I returned to the villa, Sophie was on the patio with a glass of wine, staring out at the ocean. She greeted me with a faint smile, her earlier tension momentarily masked. "How was your walk?" she asked, her voice almost too casual. "Peaceful," I replied, taking a seat across from her. We sat in silence for a while, the sound of waves filling the space between us. I could feel her watching me, waiting for something. An argument, an accusation, anything that would reveal my thoughts. But I stayed quiet, letting the silence work to my advantage. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, I finally spoke. "You've been quiet today," I said, keeping my tone light, almost conversational. Sophie hesitated for a moment, then shrugged. "Just thinking. It's been nice to get away, to have some time to reflect." Her words were carefully chosen, and I nodded as if I believed her. But the truth was, I didn't need her reflections. I needed her to start unraveling on her own, to show her hand before I played mine. Later that evening, after dinner, Sophie excused herself to take a phone call. She didn't bother explaining who it was, and I didn't ask. Instead, I listened from the other room, catching fragments of her conversation. The tone of her voice was low, clipped, nothing like the playful, charming Sophie I'd known. "Everything's fine," she said, her words sharp and hurried. "I told you, don't call me right now." "Yes, I'm handling it." It didn't take a detective to figure out who was on the other end of that call. When Sophie finally returned, she acted as though nothing had happened, sitting beside me on the couch with an air of forced ease. I didn't mention the call, didn't give her any reason to suspect I'd heard. Instead, I turned on the TV and let her think the moment had passed unnoticed. But in truth, it was another piece falling into place. Sophie's defenses were cracking, and it was only a matter of time before the whole facade came crashing down. By the second day, Sophie's tension was palpable. She tried to mask it with her usual charm, but cracks were forming in her polished exterior. She flitted around the villa like a restless bird, commenting on the decor, suggesting activities, anything to keep the energy light. I played along, letting her dig deeper into her performance. That morning, we went for a boat ride arranged by the resort. The captain gave us a tour of the surrounding islands, pointing out wildlife and private coves. Sophie laughed at his jokes, snapping photos like she was trying to capture a moment she wasn't fully present in. Her gaze darted to me every so often, gauging my reactions. I kept my responses measured, engaged enough to seem normal but distant enough to leave her unsettled. It was a careful balance, one I'd learned to maintain in business negotiations. I wasn't just her husband anymore. I was her opponent. Back at the villa, Sophie suggested a swim, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. The charm she usually wielded so effortlessly was starting to falter. As she lounged by the pool, I stepped inside to check my phone. Dan had sent another update. Calder was still making calls, leaving voicemails Sophie hadn't returned. The investigator had caught him pacing outside the fitness club, his posture tense and agitated. The photos Dan included showed Calder looking less like the rugged, exciting man Sophie had described and more like a desperate, broke lover out of his depth. Good. Let him squirm. That evening, we had dinner delivered to the villa. Sophie poured herself another glass of wine, her hand lingering on the stem of the glass a moment too long. Her conversation meandered from topics about Emma to vague remarks about their friends, but her rhythm was off. I could see it in her eyes, the uncertainty, the quiet panic of someone who knew they were losing control. After dinner, as Sophie cleared the plates, I noticed her phone lighting up on the counter. The screen showed a familiar name, Calder. The call ended quickly, but not before I saw her glance at it, her lips pressing into a thin line. She didn't say anything about it, and neither did I. Instead, I waited until she stepped into the other room, then checked her phone. The call log showed 3 missed calls from Calder in the past 2 hours. I put the phone back exactly where I'd found it and returned to the living room, pretending to scroll through emails. Sophie reappeared moments later, her smile forced as she sat beside me. For a while, we sat in silence, the hum of the villa's air conditioning the only sound. Sophie's gaze drifted toward the window, her fingers nervously tapping the arm of the chair. She didn't know I'd seen the calls. She didn't know I'd already put everything in motion. But she could feel the shift, the quiet weight of inevitability settling over us. That night, as Sophie fell asleep beside me, I stared at the ceiling, going over my next steps. She thought she was handling things, that she could keep Calder and her plans in check. But she was wrong. Sophie's world was crumbling, even if she didn't fully realize it yet. And I was going to make sure it came down piece by piece. The final day of our trip arrived, and with it came a new kind of tension. Sophie was trying harder than ever to act normal, her laughter forced and her movements deliberate. She was still playing the role of the doting wife, but the weight of her facade was starting to show. We had breakfast on the patio, the sunlight filtering through the palm trees. Sophie picked at her fruit salad, her gaze darting to me now and then, as if searching for a clue to my thoughts. I said little, sipping my coffee and reading a magazine. Let her wonder. After breakfast, we took a walk along the beach. Sophie stayed close, her hand brushing against mine as we strolled. She made small talk about the waves, the breeze, the other guests at the resort, anything but us. Her attempts to fill the silence were almost pitiable. Around midday, I suggested we head back to the villa to pack. Sophie nodded, but there was hesitation in her movements, as if she were stalling for time. Back at the villa, I sat on the edge of the bed, watching her fold her clothes with meticulous care. It struck me how different she looked from the woman I married. Her confidence, her sharp wit, her effortless charm, they were all still there, but now they felt like weapons she'd used against me. When her phone buzzed on the nightstand, she froze. Her eyes flicked to the screen, then to me. She didn't move to pick it up, but the tension in her shoulders was unmistakable. "Are you going to get that?" I asked casually, my voice steady. Sophie hesitated before shaking her head. "It's probably just spam," she said, her tone too light. I let the moment hang in the air for a beat before rising to my feet. "I'm going to grab a drink," I said, heading for the kitchen. Once out of sight, I checked my own phone. Dan had sent another update. Calder had been trying to reach Sophie all morning, his messages becoming increasingly frantic. The latest text read, "We need to talk. I can't keep waiting like this." I stared at the screen, feeling a mixture of anger and satisfaction. Calder's desperation was showing, and Sophie was clearly struggling to keep her balance. By the time we left the resort, the mood between us had shifted. Sophie was quieter, her attempts at conversation half-hearted. She stared out the window as I drove, her fingers fidgeting with the strap of her purse. Once we were home, Sophie disappeared upstairs, mumbling something about unpacking. I didn't follow her. Instead, I went to my office, shutting the door behind me. I opened the folder where I'd stored all the evidence. Photos, recordings, text logs. Each piece felt heavier now, not because I doubted what I was doing but because the enormity of it was sinking in. This wasn't just about catching Sophie in a lie. It was about dismantling a life we'd built together, one brick at a time. That evening, Sophie made dinner, a rare occurrence in recent months. She set the table with more care than usual, lighting candles and pouring wine. "I thought we could have a nice meal," she said, her voice almost tentative. "Sure," I replied, sitting down without much fanfare. The meal was delicious, but I barely tasted it. My mind was elsewhere, focused on the next steps. Sophie tried to fill the silence with stories about Emma, about her friends, about anything that wouldn't lead back to us. After dinner, as Sophie cleared the plates, I leaned back in my chair, watching her. She moved with the precision of someone trying to hold everything together, but her mask was slipping. The storm was coming, and I could tell Sophie felt it too. She just didn't know how close it was. The morning after our uneasy dinner, I woke early and made my way to the kitchen. The house was silent, save for the faint hum of the fridge. I brewed coffee, staring out the window at the manicured lawn I'd worked so hard to afford, wondering how everything had unraveled so quickly. Sophie didn't come downstairs until nearly an hour later. She was still in her robe, her hair tied back in a loose bun, looking more tired than I'd seen her in years. Her usual air of confidence was replaced by something quieter, more guarded. "Morning," she said, her voice softer than usual. "Morning," I replied without looking up from the newspaper. She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat across from me. The silence between us felt heavier than the last few days. I could see her struggling to find something to say, but whatever it was, she didn't have the courage to voice it. After breakfast, Sophie announced she was going to the fitness club. I nodded, watching as she grabbed her bag and walked out the door. The moment I heard her car pull away, I headed upstairs to retrieve the recorder I'd planted weeks ago. As I scrolled through the files, I found what I was looking for, a conversation Sophie had had late one night, presumably with Calder. "I can't talk long," she had whispered. "No, I haven't told him yet. I need more time. Yes, I know what we talked about, but it's not that simple. Miles isn't stupid. He's been different lately, quieter, like he knows something." There was a pause, and then Sophie's voice dropped even lower. "I'm handling it. Just trust me, okay?" Hearing those words again, the betrayal cut just as deep as the first time. But I pushed the anger aside. I needed to stay calm, focused. The moment was coming, and I couldn't afford to let my emotions cloud my judgment. I called Dan to confirm the next steps. His voice was steady, professional, as he outlined the evidence we'd gathered and how it would hold up in court. It was more than enough to protect my business, my assets, and my future. By the time Sophie returned home, I had the folder ready. She came through the door with her usual bright smile, tossing her gym bag onto the floor. "How was your morning?" she asked, her tone overly casual. "Productive," I replied, meeting her gaze. Her smile faltered slightly, but she recovered quickly, brushing past me to head upstairs. I stayed in the living room, my hands resting on the folder in my lap. When Sophie came back down, she looked more composed, her hair freshly washed and her makeup carefully applied. She glanced at the folder but didn't say anything, sitting across from me on the couch. "We need to talk," I said, breaking the silence. Her eyes flicked to mine, her expression carefully neutral. "What about?" I placed the folder on the coffee table between us. "About this," I said simply. Sophie didn't move at first, her eyes locked on the folder as if it might explode. Slowly, she reached for it, her hands trembling ever so slightly. She opened it and began flipping through the contents. Photos of her and Calder, transcripts of their calls, the financial documents showing how I'd insulated our assets. Her face went pale as she realized the extent of what I knew. For the first time in as long as I could remember, Sophie was speechless. "I know everything," I said, my voice calm but firm. "The affair, the lies, the plans you've been making behind my back." Sophie's hands clenched the edges of the folder, her knuckles white. "Miles, I can explain," she began, but I cut her off. "Don't," I said. "This isn't about explanations. This is about consequences." Her lips parted, but no words came out. The mask she'd worn for so long was gone, replaced by raw, unfiltered panic. I stood, my voice steady as I delivered the final blow. You wanted a fight, Sophie. Now you've got one. And trust me, you're going to lose. With that, I walked out of the room, leaving her alone with the evidence of her betrayal. 4 hours after our confrontation, Sophie stayed locked in the living room. The door was ajar, and I could hear her pacing, the occasional rustle of paper as she sifted through the damning evidence I'd left behind. I didn't bother interrupting her. Let her sit with it. Let her feel the weight of everything she'd done. Emma, thankfully, was at a friend's house, sparing her from the storm brewing at home. I stayed in my office, reviewing my lawyer's latest updates on the divorce proceedings. Victoria had already set everything in motion. With Florida's infidelity laws on my side and the airtight financial structures I'd put in place, Sophie's plans to bleed me dry were dead before they even began. By mid-afternoon, Sophie finally emerged from the living room. I heard her footsteps on the stairs, slow and deliberate, before the sound of the bedroom door closing behind her. I followed shortly after, finding her sitting on the edge of the bed, the folder now neatly closed on her lap. Her face was a mix of emotions: anger, fear, desperation. When she looked up at me, there was no trace of the confident, self-assured woman she usually presented to the world. "Miles," she began, her voice unsteady. "You didn't have to do this. Like this." I crossed my arms, leaning against the doorframe. "Didn't I?" I replied, keeping my tone even. She shook her head, frustration flashing across her features. "I know I made mistakes, but this is cruel. We could have worked through it. We could have." "No, Sophie," I interrupted. "You don't get to rewrite the story. This isn't about working through anything. This is about you betraying me, lying to me, and thinking you could get away with it." Her hands tightened around the folder, her knuckles white. "It wasn't supposed to go this far," she said, her voice breaking. "Spare me," I said coldly. "You were bragging about how you'd take me for everything. That wasn't a mistake, Sophie. That was a plan." Her gaze dropped to the floor, and for a moment, I thought I saw genuine regret flicker across her face. But it was too little, too late. "I loved you," I continued, my voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. "I built a life for us, a life you were more than happy to enjoy, until it wasn't enough for you. And now, you're going to face the consequences of your choices." Sophie didn't respond, her shoulders slumping as the reality of the situation sank in. For all her charm, her wit, and her cunning, she'd underestimated me. And now, she was paying the price. I walked out of the room, leaving her to sit with her thoughts. There was no satisfaction in seeing her like this, no sense of victory. But there was clarity. I knew what needed to be done, and I wasn't going to let her manipulate me into doubting myself. Later that evening, I made the first call to Emma's school. I wanted to ensure her routine would remain as stable as possible during the divorce. The headmistress was understanding, assuring me that they'd provide any support Emma might need. Next, I contacted my real estate agent to move forward with selling the house. Sophie had loved this place, but it was never really mine. It was hers, a monument to her tastes and her desires. I didn't want it anymore. By the time I finished, the house was quiet. Sophie had retreated to the guest room, leaving me alone in the master bedroom. For the first time in weeks, I felt a strange sense of peace. The battle was far from over, but the first blow had been struck. And for the first time, I felt like I was no longer the victim of Sophie's betrayal. I was the one taking control. The next few days were a blur of logistics and quiet tension. Sophie stayed in the guest room, emerging only to prepare meals or make brief, strained conversation with Emma. When Emma asked why her mother wasn't sleeping in their room, Sophie brushed it off with a vague excuse about my snoring. I said nothing to contradict her, letting her navigate the fallout on her own. While Sophie tried to maintain appearances, the cracks in her composure grew more evident. She was on her phone constantly, taking calls in hushed tones or typing furiously, her face a mask of worry. It didn't take much to guess who she was speaking to. Calder, according to Dan's latest updates, was unraveling. The investigator had caught him waiting outside Sophie's fitness club more than once, his attempts to reach her growing more desperate. He left voicemails pleading for her to fix this, and texts accusing her of abandoning him. Sophie's facade finally broke one evening when I walked into the kitchen to find her hunched over the counter, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. She didn't notice me at first, her shoulders trembling as she stared at the screen. "Problem?" I asked, my voice startling her. She turned sharply, trying to hide the phone, but her movements were clumsy. "It's nothing," she said quickly, her voice brittle. I didn't press her. Instead, I poured myself a glass of water, watching as she fidgeted with the phone, her fingers tapping against the counter. "You seem stressed," I said casually. Her eyes flashed with something between anger and fear. "What do you expect, Miles?" she snapped, her voice cracking. "You've turned everything upside down." I took a slow sip of water, letting her words hang in the air before responding. "I didn't turn anything upside down, Sophie. You did. I'm just making sure you don't take me down with you." She flinched, the weight of her situation visibly pressing down on her. For a moment, I thought she might lash out, but instead, she turned and walked out of the kitchen without another word. While Sophie was battling Calder's desperation and the collapse of her plans, I was quietly ensuring her standing in our social circle would never recover. I wasn't overt about it, no dramatic declarations or outright accusations. Instead, I let the evidence do the work for me. Photos of Sophie and Calder began circulating subtly among our friends, shared anonymously with carefully chosen recipients. The text messages I'd gathered made their way into the hands of key individuals, painting a clear picture of Sophie's betrayal without a single word from me. The effect was immediate. Sophie's phone calls grew longer, her frustration more evident as she tried to contain the damage. I overheard snippets of conversations, pleas for understanding, defensive explanations, attempts to spin the narrative in her favor. But the tide was already turning against her. Invitations to events dried up, casual visits from friends became rare, and Sophie's once vibrant social life began to wither. Emma noticed the change, too. "Why hasn't Aunt Rachel called?" she asked one evening, her voice tinged with confusion. "We always have dinner with her." Sophie hesitated, forcing a smile. "People are just busy, sweetheart," she said, her voice tight. I didn't correct her, but Emma's question lingered in the air, another crack in the carefully constructed illusion Sophie was trying to maintain. As Sophie fought to keep her world from collapsing, I was quietly laying the groundwork for my own fresh start. I finalized the sale of the house, securing a smaller but still comfortable home for Emma and me. Sophie didn't know it yet, but the move was happening soon. Another step in reclaiming my life. I also spent more time at the office, not just to escape the tension at home but to plan the next phase of my business. With Aloan's help, the rebranding efforts were coming together smoothly. She was efficient and sharp, her presence a refreshing contrast to the chaos Sophie had brought into my life. One evening, as I reviewed the latest designs for our new marketing campaign, Aloan knocked on my office door. "Got a minute?" she asked, holding a folder of reports. "Of course," I said, gesturing for her to sit. She placed the folder on my desk but didn't open it. Instead, she looked at me, her expression thoughtful. "You've been handling all of this well," she said after a pause. I smiled faintly. "Not much choice, is there?" "No," she admitted. "But not everyone would handle it with this much grace." Her words stayed with me long after she left. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't allowed myself to consider. Hope. The storm with Sophie wasn't over, but the horizon was starting to clear. The unraveling began in earnest a week later. Sophie had been increasingly distant, spending hours in the guest room with the door shut. Her once pristine appearance was slipping, unbrushed hair, makeup hastily applied, and the faint shadows of sleepless nights under her eyes. I didn't ask her what was wrong. I didn't need to. The slow destruction of her carefully curated world was playing out in front of me. One evening, as I was reading in the living room, Sophie came downstairs. She hesitated in the doorway, her shoulders slumped in a way I'd never seen before. "I need to talk to you," she said quietly, her voice devoid of the sharp confidence she usually carried. I set down my book and gestured for her to sit. She moved to the armchair across from me, her movements slow, deliberate, like she was carrying a weight too heavy to bear. "I know I've messed up," she began, her hands twisting in her lap. "I know I've hurt you." I said nothing, letting her words fill the silence. Her voice cracked as she continued, "I never meant for things to get this bad. I don't know what I was thinking." It was the closest she'd come to admitting fault, but it wasn't enough. Her words felt hollow, more an attempt to salvage some dignity than a genuine apology. When she finally looked up at me, her eyes were red, pleading. "Can we fix this? Can we try to go back to how things were?" I leaned back, my gaze steady. "There's no going back, Sophie," I said. "Not after everything you've done." Her breath hitched, and for a moment I thought she might lash out, blame me as she had so many times before. But instead, she buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. I didn't comfort her. I couldn't. Whatever pain she was feeling, it was a fraction of what she'd put me through. The next morning, Sophie's phone rang while she was upstairs. The name on the screen was unmistakable. Calder. I let it ring, but when it buzzed again a minute later, I picked it up and answered. "Hello," I said, my voice calm. There was a pause. Then Calder's voice came through, sharp and frantic. "Sophie? Is that you?" "No," I replied evenly. "It's Miles." The silence on the other end was satisfying. "What do you want, Calder?" I asked. "I need to talk to Sophie," he said, his voice losing its edge and replacing it with a nervous tremor. "This is between me and her." "Not anymore," I said. "It stopped being between you and her the moment you got involved in my marriage." He sputtered something unintelligible before the line went dead. When Sophie came downstairs, I handed her the phone without a word. Her eyes flicked to mine, wide with panic. "Did someone call?" she asked, her voice tight. "Calder," I said simply. "I handled it." Her face paled, and she sank into the nearest chair, her hands trembling as she clutched the phone. She didn't say anything, but the fear in her eyes was answer enough. As Sophie's grasp on her life slipped further, so did her connections to the world outside our home. Friends who once flocked to her stopped calling. Invitations to events dried up completely. Even the fitness club, her sanctuary, became a source of tension as whispers and sideways glances followed her wherever she went. One evening, I overheard her on the phone with Jenna, the one friend she still seemed to have left. "I don't know what to do," Sophie said, her voice breaking. "He's turned everyone against me." There was a long pause, and then Jenna replied, her tone hesitant. "Sophie, maybe it's not about what Miles did. Maybe it's about what you did." The line went quiet after that, and Sophie hung up without saying another word. That night, she didn't come downstairs for dinner. When Emma asked why her mom wasn't eating with us, I told her Sophie wasn't feeling well. It wasn't a lie. Sophie's isolation was complete. She had no allies left, no one to validate the choices that had led her here. And as I watched her retreat further into herself, I felt a sense of closure begin to settle over me. The life we'd built together was gone, but for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was drowning in the wreckage. I was starting to breathe again. Sophie's collapse continued in silence. She stayed in the guest room most of the time, venturing out only when necessary. Emma noticed her absence but seemed to accept my explanations without question. I shielded her as best I could, knowing that the storm was almost over. The sale of the house was finalized, and arrangements were made to move into the new home. I left Sophie out of the discussions entirely. This was my decision, my fresh start. One morning, Sophie confronted me in the kitchen. Her face was pale, and her movements were jittery, like she hadn't slept in days. "I saw the papers on your desk," she said, her voice trembling. "You're selling the house?" "Yes," I replied evenly. Her eyes widened. "You can't just sell it. This is our home, Emma's home." I met her gaze, my expression unflinching. "It was never our home, Sophie. It was mine. And I don't need it anymore." She stood there, stunned, before dropping into a chair. "You're really going through with this," she whispered. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The divorce proceedings were straightforward, thanks to the mountain of evidence I had gathered. Sophie's affair with Calder ensured she had no claim to spousal support, and the business was completely untouchable. We met with our lawyers in a sterile conference room, the tension so thick it was hard to breathe. Sophie avoided my gaze, her once confident demeanor replaced by a hollow resignation. Victoria laid out the terms with precision, leaving no room for argument. Sophie signed the papers quietly, her hands trembling slightly. When it was over, she glanced at me, her eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. Regret? Defiance? Defeat? I didn't linger. I walked out of the room without a word, feeling the weight of the past months start to lift. With the divorce finalized, Sophie moved into a modest apartment on the other side of town. Calder didn't last long. According to Dan's final report, their relationship imploded under the strain of her financial struggles and his growing resentment. Rumors spread through our old social circles, painting a picture of Sophie's fall from grace. She tried to cling to what little reputation she had left, but the damage was too great. Her charm, her wit, her ability to manipulate, it all failed her in the end. Emma adapted quickly to the new house. She loved her new room and the cozy backyard where we spent our evenings grilling or playing catch. I made sure her routine stayed as normal as possible, and she seemed happy, if a little confused by her mother's absence. One day, as we were unpacking the last of the boxes, Emma turned to me and asked, "Is Mommy okay?" I paused, unsure how to answer. "She's going through a tough time," I said carefully. "But she loves you very much." Emma nodded, accepting my words with the quiet wisdom that children often have. The car rental business thrived in the months that followed. The rebranding, spearheaded by Eloan, was a success, and the company expanded into new markets. Eloan's sharp insights and calm demeanor were a constant source of stability, and our professional relationship gradually deepened into something more. One evening, after a long day at work, Eloan and I sat in the office going over the final numbers for the quarter. As she explained the projections, her voice calm and measured, I found myself watching her with a sense of gratitude I hadn't felt in years. When she caught me staring, she raised an eyebrow. "What?" "Nothing," I said, smiling. "Just, thank you for everything." Her expression softened, and for a moment, the weight of the past year felt distant, like a bad dream I was finally waking up from. The storm Sophie had brought into my life was over, and for the first time, I felt the steady warmth of something new on the horizon. Months passed, and life settled into a rhythm I hadn't felt in years. The chaos Sophie brought was replaced by calm, and for the first time, the house felt like a real home. Emma thrived in her new environment, making friends and throwing herself into her schoolwork and hobbies. Watching her adjust with such resilience only strengthened my resolve to build a better life for both of us. One afternoon, while I was tinkering with a car in the garage, my phone buzzed with a message from Sophie. It was short. "Can we talk?" I debated ignoring it, but something in the simplicity of her request made me reply. "Fine. Tomorrow at 2. She arrived at my office the next day, dressed simply, her usual polished look replaced with something more subdued. She seemed smaller somehow, like the weight of her choices had finally caught up to her. Sophie sat across from me, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She didn't start with excuses or justifications this time. Instead, she took a deep breath and said, "I wanted to apologize." Her words were quiet but carried a sincerity I hadn't heard from her before. She went on to admit her mistakes. Not just the affair, but the lies, the manipulation, and the way she had taken me for granted. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she said, her voice trembling. "But I needed you to know that I regret everything. Not because of what I lost, but because of what I did to you and Emma." I listened without interrupting, letting her get it all out. When she finally fell silent, I nodded. "I appreciate the apology, Sophie," I said evenly. "But you're right. I can't forgive you. Not yet. Maybe not ever." She looked down, her shoulders sagging. "What I can do," I continued, "is move forward. For Emma's sake. That's all that matters to me now." Sophie nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "She's lucky to have you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. With that, she stood and left, her footsteps fading down the hall. Over the following weeks, my focus remained on Emma and the business. Sophie kept her distance, respecting the boundaries I had set. Calder had disappeared from her life entirely, and she seemed to be making an effort to rebuild herself, though I didn't involve myself in her struggles. Eloan, meanwhile, became an increasingly important part of my life. What began as a professional partnership had grown into something deeper. She brought a sense of stability and kindness that I hadn't realized I needed. One evening, as we sat on the patio of my new home, watching Emma play with our neighbor's dog, Eloan turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "You've come a long way, you know," she said. I smiled, glancing at Emma's laughter-filled face. I couldn't have done it alone. She reached for my hand, her touch warm and grounding. You're not alone anymore, she said softly. Looking at her, I realized she was right. The life I'd built with Sophie was gone, but from its ashes, something stronger had emerged. I'd learned the value of loyalty, resilience, and starting over. And as I sat there, surrounded by the pieces of my new life, I felt a peace that had eluded me for years. This wasn't the ending I had envisioned, but it was the one I needed. A new chapter, written on my terms, with the people who truly mattered.